You're listening to the Youth for Life podcast with Michelle Baum, Director of Y for Life at Lutherans for Life, where we prepare youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording of our Chats for Life program to find out how you can be live too on our next Youth for Life podcast. I am so glad that you are here to join us tonight, and I hope you have lots of questions. We have an expert presenter. He has done presentations on this before, and I'm very, very excited for Grant to be here with us. So let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for this opportunity to learn about a life issue that has affected not only our society, but also our church and the families in our church. And Lord, we ask that you be with us tonight, that as we learn about this issue and as we find ways to help those who may be struggling, and also to get the word out so that life might be supported, we ask, Lord, that you enable us to learn what we need to know, that you give us not only the knowledge, but the bravery to reach out and to help those who might be experiencing this addiction, and to remind them that this sin too is covered by the gospel, covered by the blood of Christ, and that there is no sin that has so much shame that it cannot be forgiven. We ask all of these things in your Son's name, Jesus. Amen. All right. So I'm going to pass it over. Thanks again, Dr. Carey, for being here.
Well, first let me introduce myself a little bit. So, because I'm like this weird guy that you probably never met before. So, yeah, my name is Grant. You can call me Grant. I grew up in Texas and Southern California. I went to Concordia University in Irvine to study to be a DCE. I was a DCE for 12 years, and I served in Alaska for a year, in Arizona for a couple of years, and then in Nebraska before coming here to Concordia, Texas. And so here at Concordia, I teach DCEs, directors of Christian education, who are going into youth work, children's ministry, mission work, music ministry. We send them all over to nonprofits, so all kinds of good stuff. And it's a lot of fun. I love my job. I've been here now for 8 years. I'm going to start my 9th year in next month. So looking forward to that. And so just love training people up. And also I love talking about sex. So I teach a class on sexuality here. It's called Special Topics, and it's just one of these classes that's great because we cover all kinds of stuff. And Michelle, I'm so glad you asked that question about, have you ever talked about this kind of stuff in your churches? And unfortunately, whenever I ask that question, kind of the same thing. Very few people have ever heard a message on pornography, have ever had a Bible study on it, have ever had somebody talk to them about it, especially in a church context, because it is uncomfortable. It's awkward. And we don't want to talk about it. And it's something that we definitely need to talk about. So it's one of those things that I'm glad you guys are here, and I'm glad that we talk about it. So and it's one of those things I try to bring up a lot with my college students. I brought it up a lot with my teens when I worked in ministry and churches. And so I'm glad you guys are here. So let's see. So why talk about this? I think it's a huge thing, especially in today's day and age, especially during a pandemic, because stats have shown that pornography use has gone way up because people are isolated, people are at home, they have time, they're bored, they're not connecting with people, and Satan likes to work in those times. And so especially during this time, it's time to talk about pornography. There's a lot of loneliness, that kind of thing, and technology is on the rise where you don't have to interact with a person anymore to be sexually satisfied, at least in the short term. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like, kind of the future of sexuality in some cases. So just in your, I don't think we can do this in the chat section, but go ahead, just talk it out if you have an answer. But what % of websites on the internet are pornographic? Any guesses out there?
90%.
90. No, it's not that high, thankfully.
All
It's
right.
12%. But if you think about that, close to 25 million sites are pornographic, which is pretty crazy to think about that amount and that number there. So every second, how much money is being spent on pornography? Now, there's a lot of free pornography out there, so you don't have to even spend money, but people are spending money, and a lot of that's on harder type, hardcore porn. Any guesses how much every second?
$1,000.
Thousand. Good guess. It's actually a little bit more, $3,000. So if you think about that, my math people out there, $3,000 every second times 60 times another 60 times what 24 times 31 times 365 every year. I mean, it's like billions and billions of dollars. So that's a lot of money on pornography that people are spending. What percentage of all internet downloads are pornographic? Any guesses?
5%.
Good guess. 35%. So one third. That's pretty crazy there. So it's definitely an issue in our society there. Now here's a scary one. What's the average age at which a child first sees porn online?
10.
10. Good guess. Yeah. It's 11, but that number is going down. So 10 is a great guess, and probably might be at this point the average now, which is really scary and really sad because kids are getting smartphones at earlier and earlier ages. So there's anywhere from 5, 6, 7-year-olds that are viewing porn for the first time. And now, it's a scary thing. I've got 2 teenage daughters, and they've both seen porn from things that people have sent or websites or different things, and it's just a scary reality. And we've had some good conversations, but unfortunately, a lot of people aren't having those conversations with their children about that. And so that's a scary thing, because what's imprinted in your brain early on as a child, research shows sticks with you for a long time, and that can be ingrained. And I'll talk about that in just a second too. Here's just some crazy things that 1 in 3 porn viewers are women. A lot of people think this is just a guy problem. It's not. A lot of women struggle with this too. I work with college students, and with our DCE students, we sit down with them before they're about to graduate, and we talk about, where are you struggling? Do you struggle with sex, drugs, rock and roll, those kinds of things? And you struggle with pornography, and it's amazing to hear. It really surprised me how many females actually struggle with porn, and so we usually say, you need to talk to somebody about this. I mean, we can't talk to you about that, but go find a female counselor or somebody that can really deal with that. So and then 70% of men aged 18 to 24 visit porn sites in a typical month. So that's pretty significant. And the research shows too that it's not just non-Christians, but even Christians are doing that as well. So it's a big thing. And then how many Americans? 40 million Americans. So if you think about, and this is regular visitors, so they go on multiple times a week, and that's pretty significant. If you think our country, we got about 330 million people in our country, so that's a significant number going on a couple times a week there. I love this question. This one's very interesting, but it's also kind of scary. But any guesses on the least popular day of the year for viewing porn? So out of all 365 days of the year, what's the least popular? Any guesses out there?
Christmas Day.
Christmas Day. Good guess, but no, it's not that. It is a major holiday, though. I'll give you that.
Easter.
Easter, good guess too, but it's not Easter. I'll give it to you. Here you go. Thanksgiving. And there's not a lot of research on this. They just know that it's way down. And my guess is, here's my theory, is number one, you're with your family and you're surrounded by relationships. And so, and that's a good thing, because oftentimes the craving for pornography happens most when you're lonely, when you're bored. And on Thanksgiving, you're usually with family, watching football, eating food, playing football, whatever it might be. And so that's kind of a cool thing in that. And then what about this one? Here's a fascinating one. The most popular day of the week for viewing porn is Sunday, which is pretty crazy. That one got me. number one, because I'm thinking, man, that should be the time of week when people are most spiritual, right? They're going to church. But unfortunately, church attendance is going down, spirituality is going down. And so I think Sunday is also the least busy day of the week. And so people, when you have the most idle time, that's when Satan works the most too. So Sunday really surprised me. There was a study done recently on hotel chains, and they did a study on who downloaded the pay-per-view sexually explicit movies, and it came out that sometimes Christian conferences had the highest rentership of those explicit materials. And so I saw an article one time saying that a lot of pastors really struggle with pornography. I'm not saying that your pastor does and that you need to go to them and say, Pastor, I know what you did at that conference or whatever. No, but pray for them. I mean, they're human just like you and I are, and they're dealing with tough stuff. And we'll talk about why pornography is so high in ministry people and just in general within our world. We'll talk about that in just a second. So, but before we do that, this word porn or pornography comes from the word porneia. It's a Greek word. It's actually in the Bible many, many times in the New Testament. And it basically means a selling off or surrendering of sexual purity or promiscuity of any or every type. So basically what it is, it's a cheapening of God's gift. When I talk about sex, I remember teaching a confirmation class one time, and I said, guys, God made sex, so that means everything that God made is good. So therefore, sex is good, right? And how often do you hear that in church? Like, sex is good, right? And most of the time you're like, oh, we can't talk about that here. But no, God made sex. It is for our pleasure. It's for procreation, for having kids. It's to bond us, all these kinds of things. And so sex is a good thing. God is the creator of sex. But what porn does is really fake sex, right? It's fake. And so it might fill you for a little bit, but it's not satisfying. It's not going to hold you over like real sex does, and it goes against God's design for sexuality. And so this word, anytime you see the words fornication, or you see sexual immorality, or you see prostitute or idolatry, that's usually a form of this word porneia in the New Testament. So, and it occurs over 55 times. So even in Jesus' day, people were struggling with this idea of sexuality and this cheapening of God's gift, right? So it's not a new problem. They might not have had internet porn then, but they still had that cheapening. I want to kind of tell you a story and tell you my story. When I was a kid, I was into pornography when I was in middle school and high school. And, but it was kind of like this, we didn't have the internet yet. I didn't have a cell phone yet. And so I would get it from magazines or those classified, like kind of a Target ad where somebody would be in like a bikini or a bra or a Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, or my friend brought over one time a birthday party, brought over a Playboy that he had gotten from his dad. And looking at those, I still vividly remember those images. They were burned into my brain at an early age. And so that's why it's so dangerous. We talked about that, why it's so dangerous early on to view these images is very harmful. I also think of it this way. I went to a birthday party one time, and at this birthday party, they had all this candy in a bowl. And I remember being like, man, my parents didn't really let me have a lot of sweets growing up. And so I would eat this candy. And it was kind of like these gummy hamburgers. And actually the candy at this time was Starburst. I didn't have a lot of Starburst. I loved them. I ate them like nonstop. And then we all went outside to play, and we went jumping on my friend's trampoline. And as we're jumping, I started to say, I don't feel so good. And I threw up all over the trampoline, all over my friends that were jumping on this trampoline. And it's because I indulged in this cheapening that I thought was good. It was sweet. It was good at a time, but I had to vomit that because it was not healthy for my system. Now, contrast that with, I love, growing up in California and living in Arizona, and even here in Texas, we have In-N-Out hamburgers. And some of you guys in Indiana or St. Louis may not know what that is, but just a good quality hamburger is so much different than a candy hamburger, right? And I kind of view this as like, this is God's way of viewing, of sustaining us versus the world's way and Satan's way, right? And so we want something that's fulfilling. We want something that's great. And God wants us to have good relationships and good sexuality. And so that's kind of my analogy there. And as I realized that, and I had some good mentorship, I was able to work on that. It's still a struggle. It's still hard at times, but it's one of those things that God can heal you in that way. So one more thing before we have a little Q&A and pause for a little bit, but why is this so hard? Why is this such an issue in our society? I'm going to give you 4 reasons, and they all start with the same letter to help you kind of remember that. But the first is this, like a McDonald's, it's extremely accessible, right? McDonald's is junk food. You can go anytime, anywhere, get one. It doesn't mean it's the most healthy for you. Same as pornography. It's extremely accessible. You can get it on your phones, anytime, anywhere you want, right? As long as you have service, and you can even take pictures or download those easily. And people have fake kind of apps to hide those things. And I mean, it's so accessible, even more so than it was 20, 30 years ago. And so that's one of the reasons it's so hard for a lot of people. Another one is it's anonymous. Nobody has to know that you're dealing with this, right? They might know if you're gossiping because you're gossiping about them. They might know if you've got a problem with anger because they're going to see the effects of that. But they might not ever see the effects of your pornography here. It's very affordable. Like I said, it's free. You can spend money on hardcore stuff, but if you just want to find naked people on the internet, you can do that. And so it's very affordable, and it's easy to find. And lastly, it's very addictive. And this is the one that we don't always talk about, is that sex always starts in the brain. People think, oh, it starts in our bodies or in our genitals. It doesn't. It actually starts in our brain. And our brain is what triggers us to have addictions. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But if you think about these 4 things, and you think about like hardcore drugs, okay? Is it extremely accessible? Not always. It's hard to find, if you wanted to find crystal meth, that's probably a little bit hard to find, right? Is it anonymous? It might be for a while, but you're going to get found out because you're going to have side effects of that, and you're going to have symptoms of that, right? Is it affordable? No, that stuff's expensive, right? Is it addictive? Yes. So as you can see, like there's, it's a little bit different, whereas pornography hits all of these 4 really well. Hardcore drug doesn't really, and so it's just like that, but even worse of an addiction, right? And it's one of our society has kind of said it's not really that big a deal. And so we'll talk about that too. Is it really so harmful? Is it really so harmful? Let's talk about this. Time magazine, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, came out with this article. And it was, front page, and it was a huge article in here. And what they found is, Time's pretty a liberal magazine too. What they found is that all these guys that were engaging in porn that they thought was not a big deal because you're not hurting anybody, you're not, it's all yourself. You're not getting diseases from it. You're not getting anybody pregnant. All these kinds of things. And what they found is that it actually was very harmful to people, and that it caused a lot of symptoms. And we'll talk about that more later too. But they found guys were really struggling, and it was affecting every part of their life. And so it was so important to talk about that. And I give Time a lot of credit for being able to address that. And there were a lot of good stories in there. So if you want to check that out, it was actually from 2016 in April. So great article if you want to search that and talk about that. So as I talked about too, that sexuality starts in the brain. Your brain is your number 1 sex organ. And so great book called Hooked. I'll just give you a synopsis of this. What they say in this book is that everything that we do that causes an addiction or some kind of pleasure center starts in our brain. So think about it in terms of this. You eat a good meal, and dopamine is released in your brain, and it makes you feel good, and it makes you crave that another time, right? Or maybe you exercise. I like having exercise. I don't always like exercising. Does that make sense? Like in the process, I always like being done with it. But when I'm done with it, I feel really good, right? And you get those endorphins and that adrenaline. You're like, man, I feel so great. And that's part of that dopamine release too, is that, and so part of this is like, it makes you want to do it again. And so sexuality is the same way, is that in our brain, when we're engaged sexually, that dopamine is released, and so then it makes us want it again and again. I often talked to my students one time. I said, if you think about sex, it's actually a really weird thing. Like, who, if it didn't feel good, would, and if we didn't have the pleasure center in our brain, who would willingly take off their clothes and connect it to another person? That's just a weird thing, but God made this a beautiful thing, made it pleasurable, but also made it have a benefit of having kids and having that connection, that one flesh that Genesis talks about. And so this book, this Hooked, give you a better example. It's these neurons that fire up and cause pathways. When I was in college, you've got this sidewalk here, and in order to get to that parking lot, you could go around on that sidewalk, but as you can notice, people just started to go take the shortcut and make their own path. And that's kind of like pornography, right? God's way, yes, it might be harder, where he says, wait till marriage, don't engage in pornography, don't cheapen it, none of the pornania kind of stuff, and go on that sidewalk. But what we do is we take the easy way, we make that path. And what the brain science says is the more you take that path, the more addicted you are, the more other people will take that, because it's like, oh, that's the way to go. I'm going to do that. Everybody else is doing it, kind of thing. And so it's one of those kind of things that our brain, the more we do that, the more we get engaged in that, the more we're addicted to it. Now, the good news is, and we'll talk about this later on too, is that we can break that addiction. We can break that, and that is the main thing, because our brain is very, it's plasticity. It's a fancy word for meaning it can be moldable very easily. And so if we disengage in pornography, we can actually loosen that pathway. So the same way, if somebody put up a barrier on this pathway and said, no, you have to take the sidewalk, eventually that grass would start growing back and it would go back to normal, right? The same with our brains. If we disengage from pornography and those images and those thoughts, eventually our brains will return to how God actually designed us. And so that's the good news. That's some hope. And we'll talk about that more later on. So I'm going to pause us right here and stop the sharing and see if there's any discussion or questions or anything. So
This is probably more toward the second half of this talk, but if you know someone who just overcame a porn addiction and they still continue to feel guilty about it, even though they're past it, what are some things that they can do to not feel so guilty?
Yeah, great question. I think a big thing is just, especially if they're Christian, to be in the Word, because that's where we get that grace from God, and we hear about Jesus' amazing love. To have friends that pour into them and let them know that, to take communion often, to a lot of these are churchy kind of things, but that's where we receive grace and forgiveness, right? But to be reminded of that they are a new creation, that they are not a slave to that anymore, and that God has redeemed them. And so I think it's just important to remind them of that. So, but yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit more later on too. But great question. Yeah, great question.
What other questions do you guys have so far? And it's okay if you want to write it in the chat, but are there facts that he brought up that were surprising to you? I mean, I have a question, and that is, do you know the percentages and the facts that you shared with us in America? Are those percentages similar worldwide? Do you know, is that research available, or is this just the sinful human condition, or is this unique to America?
Great question. In some countries, it's actually higher. Countries like Japan, China, the Philippines, I'll talk about them in just a little bit, especially where technology is high and where there's not always a lot of hope or a lot of activities for people to keep busy with, or where there's not a central morality within a culture, where just anything goes. It's definitely higher. And then there's also some that are lower, where they're a little bit less sexualized. There's a lot of countries that look at America, look at the United States and say, we're going to hell because we are, very progressive in our sexuality and what we show on TVs and movies and those kinds of things, and some of the laws we have. So yeah, there are definitely differences around the world, but we're definitely up there as Americans. So yeah, great question. And actually, a lot of the pornography comes from the United States. So because we have the budgets, we have the technology to be able to produce that worldwide.
I guess I have one more question too, and I think if you're going to talk about it later, then that's fine too. I can't remember the order, but we just did 2 weeks ago a section on human trafficking. And what is the connection between human trafficking and pornography? Is there a connection? How tenuous is that connection, or how solid? I guess if you're going to cover it later, don't worry about answering it now, but that would be an appropriate connection for, the students here. So.
Yeah. I was going to talk about that later, but I'll talk about it now because it's a great question and something that's on our minds. There's a huge connection to pornography and human trafficking. Number one, because supply and demand. So because so many people are addicted to pornography, eventually that wears out and you need something harder and harder. Like it's the same way as any addiction, that eventually you get bored with the status quo, and you have to have something a little bit more. And that's how people overdose on drugs, is because eventually that high isn't high enough. So they have to keep going, and they do it to the detriment of their health. Same with pornography and trafficking, is that eventually pornography gets old, gets stale, and you got to find ways to have that connection with human flesh. And unfortunately, trafficking is a big part of that. Another part of that too is that because the demand is so high, there's a lot of, especially young girls, that are trafficked or put in the porn industry to fulfill that demand. And so that's part of it as well, is that, they can make a lot of money too, selling their body and doing these acts on videos, to please all these fantasies that guys have, and girls too. So yeah, great question. Yeah, I'll talk about some of the other kind of pitfalls of pornography, but that's definitely a big one. Because what porn does too is that, if you think about it, what you see with that image when you're viewing pornography is you are dehumanizing that person, right? That is not a person with a soul anymore. That is not a person who's somebody's daughter, right? That is now just an image to you for you to fulfill your cravings. And so you are dehumanizing them. And part of that is, when we dehumanize somebody on a video or a picture, we can also then start to do that in real life. And that's a scary thing, because we know God gives us life, and he values human life. And I mean, that's what this is all about, right? It's what you guys are standing for. So absolutely.
We might cover this later, but what should we do if we find out that, like, someone we're close with, or even like someone that we're dating, struggles with this?
Yeah, great question. I'm actually going to hold off on that one because that's more towards the end. So, but great question, Olivia, because I think as Christians and as people, we need to be equipped to be able to help people with this. So absolutely. So yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I was gonna ask, I know that you said that you saw you said that there was a higher percentage of Christian pastors and clergy people that participate in pornography. And I was wondering, with the Catholic Church, since priests aren't supposed to get married, do you see a higher number of them, since they can't be with a partner and be satisfied sexually that way, than you do with Protestant pastors who can get married?
That's a great question. To be honest, I haven't seen that research as much, so I can't speak on that for sure. But my guess is yes, because whenever you say no to something and stifle that, it usually manifests itself in unhealthy ways, right? And so porn will cause you to go deeper down that trail, to eventually where they're molesting children because they feel like, well, I can get away with that. And technically I'm not, having sex with a woman, or right. So those kinds of things. And so, yeah, there are some perversions that can happen from that. Again, I don't know the exact research on that, but I would say that could be part of that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Great question. So, all right, let's move on a little bit. So a lot of people say, well, I don't really struggle with porn. It's not really a big deal to me. Yeah, I might engage with it a little bit, but here's kind of just a checklist of, if somebody does and they might have an issue, or we might have an issue. Do you think about sex often? And so that's just if you think about it often, again, it all starts in your mind. And so if you're thinking about it, and oftentimes just seeing something can trigger something to where you're thinking about it, right? Have you tried to stop and just couldn't? Again, that's a sign of an addiction. Do you find yourself controlled by your desires? Have you been doing something and all of a sudden you think about it and it causes you to do something else and engage in that pornography, right? And that's being controlled by our desires. Do we look at it online? That's definitely part of that. Here's one that's kind of fascinating, is that pornography doesn't always have to be images. It can also be words. And so, a romantic novel or some kind of magazine or story form. So a couple years ago, 50 Shades of Grey was a big thing. And that was basically called mommy porn, because what it was is people were reading it and getting excited, and basically it was pornography without images. And so it's still causing that lust. It's still causing that unhealthy desire, right? So even just reading something can be dangerous there. And then have you ever felt guilt over masturbating? And that's part of that struggle with pornography too. It's addictive. All right. So what are some of the things that can cause? And so here's some things. It causes relationship struggles. You talked about being in a relationship with someone who wrestles with it. A lot of times that can hurt relationships. I knew of one of my friends. He is a pastor, and he had pornography on his computer, and his wife caught him, and they had to really wrestle through that. That was tough on the relationship. They're a lot better now. He's very thankful for being caught, because now he has some accountability. Now his wife knows about it and knows his struggles and can help him with that. He's seeing counseling now. And so, but for a lot of relationships, that can ruin that, especially if there's no accountability or it's done in secret, right? It causes divorces, right? Because if you think about this, like if my partner is not satisfying me and I'm running into pornography, I am now thinking, okay, where can I find that satisfaction? And maybe that leads now from pornography to other relationships, and now I'm cheating on my spouse because I want something better. I want the grass to be greener. And we know that's not the case, right? And so pornography can cause that. Infidelity, cheating, and we just talked about that. And then cyber sex, especially these days and ages where we're quarantined. I mean, there's a lot more online kind of stuff through Snapchat, through just any kind of social media where it's way more accessible. So there's that. Here's some other ones from a great website, Fight the New Drug. I highly recommend it. All kinds of great resources on there. I'll talk about that a little bit more later too, but here's just some things that could help you prefer fantasy to reality. Again, pornography is not real. It's fake. It's a cheapened alternative to God's design. It can normalize things that you previously thought were wrong, because you rationalize, you say, that's really not that bad, right? Again, dissatisfaction in your relationships, produce guilt and shame, and keep you from healthy relationships, making you feel, back to your question, I think that was Lily that asked that, that it could keep you from feeling like you're good enough for somebody, because you have this struggle, and that's a lie, right? Mess up your sex life, could actually lead to an actual addiction. Here's a big one that's not often talked about. Could cause erectile dysfunction. One of the reasons I think we see these Viagra commercials or whatever it might be, there's so many different options now, is because there's young guys who have erectile dysfunction, and because they're so ingrained with pornography and so addicted, that when they're actually with somebody, a live human being, whether it be their wife or a girlfriend or whatever, not that that's right, but it's reality, that they can't be satisfied with that person. And that's really, really sad. In Japan, I talked about Japan having that really high rate of pornography, that guys in Japan have gotten so addicted to pornography that there are now so many guys choosing not to get married. And so there's a lot of single gals out there that just can't find good guys to marry, because the guys don't want to get married because they're perfectly happy with their pornography, and they just don't know how to develop relationships with females. And so there's a lot of social implications there as well. And then we talked about that objectifying other people and seeing them just as, a way to fulfill your desire rather than an actual human being that God created. So there's that. I want to talk about this. This is a case study from Philippines. Philippines is #1 in pornography in the world per capita. So, which is kind of crazy because it's more of a third world country than the United States. But what they did, and they kind of went around this backwards to find this, is what they did is here's the things that were really high in the country: teenage pregnancy, premarital sex was way up, rape was way up, sex violence and sex trafficking were way up. And so what they did is they said, all right, we're going to look at kind of the root causes of this and not just symptoms, because it's really easy to say, all right, let's have rape training and sexual assault training. Let's try to deal with sex trafficking. Let's try to deal with premarital sex or teenage pregnancy and just give them condoms or whatever that might be. But what somebody did is say, no, what's the deeper issue to this? And what they found is that it was pornography, that young boys especially were engaging in pornography as early as 7 and 8. And that led them to then grow up with an unhealthy view of sexuality, and then a lot of these things manifest out of that. So pretty crazy there. Another case study here is Ted Bundy. He was a serial killer. He was on death row. Actually became a Christian like on death row before he died. But he said in an interview one time that he credits, I don't know if you know his story, but he killed over 30 people. He was a serial murderer and also a rapist. And so, but he credits that unhealthy view of killing and sexuality to his early addiction to pornography. Because what happened is softcore porn turned into hardcore porn. Hardcore porn eventually didn't satisfy him, so he went to more hardcore violent porn. And then he went to homicidal sexual fantasies. And from then he actually lived those out, which is pretty crazy. I'm not saying everybody who engages in pornography will get to that point, but it's just, it's crazy to think kind of that slippery slope that can happen. And that started with pornography in his own words. And so that's a scary, scary thing. So that's enough of the scary part. Let's get to more of the gospel and more of the hope of it. But here's the thing is a lot of you guys probably have friends that are dealing with this, or you may be dealing with this. And the big question to ask them is, do they want to actually get well? Do you want to actually get well? There's this great story in John 5 where there's this invalid there. They're at this pool of Bethesda, and this pool is like a healing pool. And this person has no arms, no legs. They're sitting there, and for 38 years, they've been trying to get to this pool, but they never can because people always go in front of them. Nobody's there to help them. And so Jesus comes up to this person and asks them this question: do you want to get well? Now he could have easily just said, oh, that guy needs help, I'm going to go help him. But no, he asked the question, does he have that will? Does he actually want to get well? And so the same question I think he asks us: do we want to get well, or are we comfortable in our sin, right? And sometimes we have to hit rock bottom in order to say, oh, this isn't working for me. I need something better. I need to change. And that's when, unfortunately, when we actually want to get well. I see it all the time with addictions and with just people going down that downward spiral. Sometimes they have to hit that rock bottom before they actually say, okay, now I'm ready to give this up and get something better, right? And so that question to ask is do they want to get well? And if not, it's hard to help them. You can try all you want, but if there's no desire there, it can be really hard. And so the best thing then is just to pray for them, to help them, and hopefully they'll get there to where they say, yeah, I need some help, right? So I want to give you here to close us up 6 non-destructive things to help deal with porn. I put non-destructive because I love, there's an older Christian movie called Fireproof, where this guy has a pornography addiction, and he takes his computer outside and he says, you know what, I'm just tired of this. And so he takes a baseball bat and he just slams his computer and kills it, right? And obviously that's one way to get rid of pornography is, right, to destroy your phone, destroy your computers, just get rid of all of that. And while that might be one way of doing that, that's probably not the most logical way because that's expensive and you need that for other things. So what are some non-destructive ways of dealing with that? And before I get into that, oftentimes people think, oh, I just need the one thing that will help me get over this, right? I just need that one magic bullet. And there's not really. As holistic beings, God created us with mind, body, soul, and spirit. We need all those aspects to be filled in our life. And so I want to give 4 areas that we really need to work on if we really want to get over this, or if we want to help somebody get over this. They need a relationship with God, a growing relationship, a healthy relationship of themselves, have mentors in their life, and then also friends in their life that will help them through this. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but if they only are trying to pray it away, right, and only have God, it's not enough, right? If they only try to do it with their own willpower and say, I can do this, I can make this happen, again, it's not enough. But you got to have those other people, right? Friends to help you out and to say, how you doing with this? And mentors to ask you those hard questions and to keep you accountable. I'll talk about that a little bit too in just a bit. So here's my top 6. All right, my 6th one is flee. 1 Corinthians 6 says, flee from all sexual immorality. Basically what that means is don't just oh, there's temptation, I'm just gonna kind of willy-nilly away from it. No, run away from that. If you are tempted by your phone, then don't sleep with your phone in your bedroom, right? Plug it in the kitchen and so you won't be tempted at night, right? If you are alone home and you're tempted all of a sudden, flee from that. Like, go for a walk, go for a bike ride, get outside, do something different that is not going to be engaging your mind and making you dwell on that. Oftentimes, St. Paul says this. He says, my mind is or my spirit is willing, but my body is weak, right? We are weak creatures. We are weak, sinful creatures. And if we think we can just think it away, it's not going to happen, right? If I put a piece of chocolate cake on the table and I say, I'm not going to eat that, right? Eventually, just the smell of that, the sight of that, because it's in my presence, I'm going to want to eat that, right? I got to get that out of there so I'm not even thinking about it, right? So that's the first one, flee, run away as much as possible. So that might also mean like putting some filters on your computer, or getting accountability with mentors. I'll talk about that in a little second. But like I mentioned before, this plasticity of our brain, that we can rewire our brain for good, is great. Because if you look at this, the more days we go porn free, so look, at 14, it's pretty significant. You go from 100% to almost 20% if you can go for 2 weeks without porn. We just know that about habits, right? If we can engage in a habit for 2 or 3 weeks, it becomes a rhythm, a reality for us. And so the same way, that if we can just say, all right, one day at a time, I'm just going to choose not to engage in this. I'm going to put these other things in place. That can be a huge help. Rather than say, I'm never going to do this ever again. I mean, that's kind of an unrealistic expectation. If we can just say, all right, just 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 2 weeks, right? And just take that 1 day at a time. That's huge. That's huge. Number 5 is this: be transparent. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So here's the thing: we're all struggling with things. We all have baggage, and we all have stuff. And so, what's surprising is, I led a small group of guys one time, and we brought this subject up and we started talking about it. And one after another said, oh, me too. Yeah, I struggle with that also. And just because one person was willing to say, yes, I struggle with this, everybody else was able to be transparent, because they realized all right, I'm in a non-judgment zone because everybody's struggling with that. And that's really what the church should be about, right? We're all wrestling with things. We're all sinners. Jesus said, we don't go to church, or nobody goes to a hospital if they're well, right? They go to a hospital if they're sick, same as the church. We don't go to church because we're well. We go because we're sinful human beings and we need God's grace. And so be transparent, be willing to take that risk, be willing to open up and share, and have other people say, yeah, I wrestle with that as well. Because there's huge power in when we keep things inside of us and we don't let those out, they seem to fester and get worse, right? But if we can talk that through with someone and share that, it kind of loses its power. And so that's a huge part of that. All right, I'm gonna pause right there before we finish the other four. Any questions or thoughts?
So with a lot of things in terms of addictions and mental illnesses, they almost say like, don't try to interfere and don't try to advise people because that's what a counselor and adults are for. So with this, though, you are saying that it is actually a good idea for peers to talk to people about it?
Good question. Yeah, and you're not giving counsel to them. You're not telling them what to do. You're just being there to listen to them, right? And be a non-judgment presence. And so that's really what I'm talking about, is more of like just being available to them, to listen, to check in with them, to just care for them. So yeah, more of that. Just so they don't feel isolated, so they don't feel like nobody cares or that they're doing this all alone, but just to know that, hey, I'm here walking with you. So yeah, great question. Good clarification. Thank you.
And some of the things that he mentioned before, like, if you're going to be tempted to change direction, to find something to do, to find someone to be with. And so, I had a student that struggled with pornography and also with premarital sex. And he broke down and was crying one day and talked to me about it. And we kind of talked about the times when it was worse for him, times in the evening. And so when he, I talked to him about finding a friend to talk to during that time, or spending time with his parents, or those sort of things. And there were a few times in college when he would text me during those times, and we would just have a text conversation, because and I knew that the reason he was texting me is because he needed someone to distract him. And so when you walk with someone, as Grant said, sometimes you're just the friend they can talk to to get their mind off of this temptation. So.
All right, I'll jump back in, and then if you think of any, we'll finish up here, and then feel free to ask those. So here we go. Let's see. All right, number 4 is this: be committed. Again, that goes to saying, do you want to get well? Having that commitment to say, yes, this is something I really want to commit to. You can't just do it half-heartedly. You have to say, yes, I'm all in. I need help, Jesus. Help me, right? Help my unbelief in this way. And Romans 12:2, I think, gives us a great picture of this. And I love this verse because it gets addiction so well. Romans 12:2, if you know this verse, it says this: do not be conformed by the ways of this world. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Again, St. Paul knows that it's about your mind, and that we need to daily renew our mind to get rid of those lies that Satan tells us, to get rid of the temptations that go on in our mind, and to not be transformed by the ways of this world, but reformed, transformed, right? I love that. And so by being committed and by saying every day we're renewing our mind, what does that look like? We're getting in the Word every day, and that helps reform us and transform us, right? It changes us. By having conversations with mentors and friends, by praying, those kinds of things. Those are the things that help transform us. So yeah. Number 3 is this: be accountable. James 5 says this: confess all your sins to one another. Now, this doesn't mean you confess your sins to everybody you meet at school or even at church, but it means that you have somebody that you can talk to, that you can really confess to and that you can be honest and open with, because the more you can do that, the less power, again, this will have over you. So being accountable. There's great ways to do that. Here's a bunch of websites. There's tons of them out there. But all of these have a lot of helps. And many of them have software that you can download on your computer or put on your phone that will, basically how it works is if you do have some kind of questionable site, it'll send an email or a text to whoever you set that up to, and then they will get that. There's different ways you can do that. You can do it every time you do it, once a day, once a week, a summary. And so then that other person that's keeping you accountable can kind of look through that and say, oh, I see you were on this site. Tell me more about that. Or how you doing with this? Or I see this was a tough week for you, that you were really struggling. How can I help you? Those kinds of things. I've got a couple former college students that I still keep in contact with, and one of the guys uses Accountable to You here at the bottom, and I still get updates probably 2 or 3 times a day, just with any kind of questionable sites. And sometimes it flags you just for a site that's not even questionable at all, but there might be a keyword in there that they thought was bad or could be bad, and it really isn't. But at least I can see those. And if there is something, usually I'll just shoot them an email and say, hey man, I saw you were looking at this. What's going on? Everything okay? And most of the time we have a good relationship now where he'll say, yeah, I was just having a tough day. And I will always respond, not in law, not with fear, but just say, man, I feel for you. I'm praying for you. Jesus loves you. You're forgiven, that kind of stuff. Because they just really need somebody there for them, right? They just need somebody to speak truth, somebody to know that somebody's watching out for them, but also somebody that will share grace with them. So yeah. Triple X Church is a great one. Some of these are free. Some of them you have to pay for. So obviously there's always ways to get around these things. But the ones you pay for are a little harder to do. So if you don't trust yourself, I would definitely invest in that and do that. But if you're just trying to, keep away from that, there's some cheaper ones or some free ones there for you. So check out any of those. Number 2 is this: pray. Pray is a huge part of this, right? Philippians 4:6-7 says, do not be anxious about anything. In every situation, by prayer and petition, submit your requests to God. So we've got a lot of anxiety. We've got a lot of guilt. We've got a lot of just fear in our society. And this is just a great verse for everybody during this pandemic time, right? But especially for those dealing with pornography, that anytime we feel anxious about that, we can go right to God, right? We don't have to go get a Bible. We don't have to go to church. We can instantly access the power of Jesus through prayer and pray against that temptation. And so that's something that's very accessible to us. And if you are trying to help your friend, don't just say, I'm going to pray for you. Actually pray for them, right? So just say, hey, can I pray for you right now? Whether it's over the phone or you send them a quick text praying for them. But it's always good to pray with them, not just say you're going to pray for them, but actually do that with them. And that's a huge part if you want to help your friend out with that. All right, the last one, ready, drum roll here. Experience grace. And especially as Lutheran Christians, we hopefully get the gospel. And Romans 5:8 says this. It says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Right? I love that verse because it doesn't say once we get our stuff together, then Jesus will love us, or once we're good enough, then we can experience grace. No, it says while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, that he, in the midst of our messiness and our brokenness, that he came for us and that he forgives us, he renews us, he died for us and gave his life for us. And so know that. And if you're helping a friend, help them experience that. Keep giving them those words of comfort and of hope, because again, we've talked a lot about guilt and shame. And I don't know if you ever heard the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt's something good because it says we've done something wrong, but shame says that we are, as a person, we are not good, right? So guilt's okay because it's about an action. Shame is about our character. And so we want to get people away from experiencing shame and more towards like guilt, where they can be forgiven of that. Does that make sense? So again, it's not about making somebody feel really bad and saying that's their identity as a shameful person, but rather that their identity is someone who's covered in Christ, that's clean and forgiven, and that's made new. And that's what we all are. We're new creations. And so this kind of holistic thing, if we put all that together and we say, all right, God can help us through prayer and through experiencing the sacraments and through going to church and reading scripture, and we can help ourselves by saying, yes, I'm wrestling with this. I'm going to be honest with myself. I'm going to say, yes, I do want help, with our mentors, and maybe it's just one or two in place that can help and check us. And then also with our friends who are checking in with us, and we're opening up to them and saying, I struggle with this, right? With all these things together, that's where healing comes, right? That's where healing comes. I will say this, there are some that can't do it on their own. I have a former student too, who went to, it's kind of like AA, but for pornography. And he's in this 12-step program, and he's still wrestling with it. And he still wrestles, and it's one day at a time. It's one day at a time, but he is doing way better than he was before. And he says, that was a really hard season of my life, but I'm so glad I was able to do the hard stuff to be able to get to where I'm at now. So there are resources out there that can really help people if they're really deeply ingrained in pornography. So I just want to share that too and let you know that. So
I just want to thank you for your presentation. I also wanted to comment on two of those steps, the transparency and the experiencing grace. I think it's great when you can go to peers and friends and have these conversations, but I also want to encourage everybody to consider your pastor a great resource for that. Private confession and absolution is built for both the transparency and the experience grace section. And your pastor is not going to be surprised. He's not going to condemn you. He's heard it and seen it and expects it all, and he's going to keep it private. And he's the place that you can really turn to hear that word of forgiveness. So I would encourage that.
And definitely back to Olivia's comment or question earlier about, what if you're dating someone who's struggling with this? This is something that you should encourage a pastoral intervention and counseling even before. I think going through premarital counseling, even before or during that engagement process, obviously you should be doing it before marriage, but what steps are in place? Are there some, pornography creates a sense of mistrust between a husband and wife, and it can also create a lot of hardship with fulfillment, as Grant has mentioned. And so those are things definitely that you don't just say, oh, well, we'll fix it later. But it is something to talk about long before marriage, and how you work through that together will either strengthen your relationship, right? And you will become two who are fighting the same battle and who are supporting each other, or it can be very divisive. And my husband is a pastor, and he has seen, I'm not privy to that information, but he would say pornography breaks up a lot of marriages, and so it's something you should be addressing long before. Yeah. Lily, you have a question.
Is there a way to reach out to people who do not view porn to, I don't want to say be more accepting of it, but just to not react horribly when they find out that someone watches it? Because with being in a Christian school and stuff like that, a lot of people are judgmental about that kind of thing, and it prevents others from talking about it when they probably should.
I think just as much as possible, creating an environment where you can be real, and that might be hard at a Christian school, I know, because it's a little bit larger, but hopefully you're engaged in some kind of youth group or kind of ministry to where you have that safe space, or a small group. I would say that's kind of where some of that can happen. But yeah, at a large school that might be harder. I don't have a great answer for you. I don't know. Anybody else have a open that up?
Really, I would say talking to your theology teachers and asking them to bring it up in the classroom, asking them to talk about it as a discussion point, I think is pretty helpful. When a teacher is open to having a discussion about it in their classroom, and you know, I was, and I know that doesn't mean that it was a comfortable discussion. You know, you could see some kids kind of wriggling in their seats, like, "Are you kidding? Are we really talking about this?" But just breaking the ice in that way, as an adult, saying it's okay to talk about this struggle. It's a real struggle, and it might be easier if you approach it from that perspective, and definitely from a faith perspective. I mean, we have a gift as Christians that we can give the world, and there are many people at your high school that are not Christian or do not attend church and do not hear that gospel message. And so it's important not only for them to know that it's wrong, because society would say that it's not wrong, but it's important for them to know that it's wrong and that it's harmful. The loving thing to do is to have it addressed, right? You wouldn't, if your kid walked out into the middle of the street, or your best friend when a bus was coming, you wouldn't say to your best friend, "Well, I wouldn't choose to do that, but you know, if you're okay with it, I guess, you know, it's your choice." No, you would be like, "Don't do that. This, you know, I want to help you. I love you. I care about you." And pornography has long lasting effects. And so addressing it would be good, you know. And if you don't want to do it as a classmate, and maybe that would be totally uncomfortable, you know, ask a teacher you trust.
I certainly can appreciate the sense of what you're saying, because from the standpoint of sins, I think we often judge one sin as being okay over another, or one sin being worse than another. You hear that when people say, "Well, yeah, well, at least I'm not a murderer," or, you know, a sexual idolater. But, you know, pointing to scripture, you can see what Paul says. I mean, he puts gossips and, you know, busybodies in the same sentences as sexual idolaters and murderers. We recognize that all sin breaks that relationship with God and breaks relationships with people. And so it's kind of up to you and other members of your school to inculcate that culture of life, recognizing that everybody is a sinner before God, and that Christ died for all of those sins. There is no one sin that condemns more than another. And to be able to share that, so that people can be open and honest, and just say, "Hey, I'm a sinner," you know, no matter what it is. That commonality that we have in the human condition should give us also that commonality of empathy for each one of us, no matter what the struggle is. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, you know, expressed how you know, he didn't have the particular struggle with gambling. That was something that wasn't a part of his struggle, but he had other things that he struggled with. And so he could have empathy with the same person who had issues with gambling, and he could understand because he experienced it in other ways. So the person hooked on pornography has that struggle, but you are going through struggles. So everybody else in the school is going through other struggles that are just as difficult for them to deal with. Pornography may not be the one for them, but they should have the empathy because they know what it's like for their own particular struggle.
And we do know St. Paul does talk about how some sins really cause us to fall from the faith even faster than maybe others. And so we have to recognize that sexual sins are in that list. And so again, going back to that imagery, would you let someone you love walk out in front of a bus? You know, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that. And if the ultimate goal to support life is to see that life in heaven, which should be our ultimate goal, we want to reach out with care and concern and and encourage that individual to have accountability, to, if they need help, to seek that help, outside help. I think there are some secular facts too, and Grant gave you many of those, and there's even more online, as far as the effect on families. I know some of you have mentioned that you'd like to know how to address it in a way that's secular as well, not just faith-based. And ultimately, I think faith-based is the best way to address things, but I do know that if you're talking with a friend who's not a Christian, it's important to use some of those hard facts too. And breaking marriages, broken marriages, dissatisfaction in marriage. There's lots of statistics that talk about not only pornography, but premarital sex being something that actually increases the divorce rate. Most people, whether they're Christian or not, they want a healthy marriage. They want to stay married.
Yeah, and to add to that too, I think a lot of, I've talked to Christian guys before that say, oh, I'm engaging it now, but once I get married, that'll go away and I won't have that temptation anymore. And that's just not true. Yeah, research shows that if you're engaging it before you get married, that just because you start having sex, if you waited and now you're having sex, but you're still going to engage in pornography if you were before. So it can be very dangerous that way.
Well, thank you, all of you, for coming. And Grant, thank you very much for talking to us about this issue. It is definitely one that needs to be addressed and talked about. So.
Yeah, thank you guys for being a great group, and I really appreciate all you guys do. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for joining us for today's life topic. Check out whyforlife.org or email Michelle at whyforlife.org to find out how and when you can go live with us at our next Chats for Life session. Or join us next time right here at Why for Life Podcasts, where youth learn how to be gospel-motivated voices for life.